Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners. Thank you, as always, for joining us for our weekly podcast. And today is a returning guest. It's a friend of the podcast and somebody who Emily Onis and I had the pleasure of interviewing last year with regard to this organisation's HR mental wellbeing report. So we have got with us today the fabulous Dr. Jo Burrell, who is a clinical psychologist, coach and co-founder of Ultimate Resilience. Jo, how you doing? You all right?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Splendid, really good. I'm glad to have you back on the pod as well, not least because I get to ask you a fundamentally different question, but actually I'm really interested to get into the nub of, I guess it's year 2 of this report, isn't it? So yes. What we will do, for those of you listening in, we will pop a link in the show notes to this report. Emily Onis and I quizzed Jo on this last year, and we decided to get her back on because they've gone for another round of some quite interesting stats around HR. And as Jo and her team point out, I think it is the only one of its kind, isn't it, Jo, in terms of looking at HR mental and health well-being?
I believe so, yes. I mean, I'm aware of one other that's been conducted, which is described as HR wellbeing, but ours, I think, is the only one that focuses specifically on mental wellbeing, so the mental health of HR.
So we're going to get into that. But before we get into the serious stuff, I get to ask my fundamentally different question. So perhaps you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and then also Ultimate Resilience as well.
Sure. So as you said, I'm Dr. Jo Burrell. I am a clinical psychologist by background. I spent well over 20 years working in the NHS in mental health services as a clinician, a leader, and set up my business Ultimate Resilience with my business partner, Dr. Felicity Baker, around 10 years ago, actually. And we set our business up because we found in the NHS that we were seeing lots of people who were suffering from mental health problems whose difficulties really originated at work. So it was work-related stress, anxiety, depression, trauma sometimes. And the model of delivery in the NHS is such that you can't go into organisations and tackle those kind of problems at source. And so we were really interested in doing that. And that was why we set up our business. We'll be talking most of this session today about HR mental wellbeing, but since then we've become particularly interested in HR mental wellbeing, and actually our services are largely targeted at HR themselves now. Them having been the commissioners of our services and not necessarily the people who used our services or utilised them, they are now the recipients largely of our services.
Just before we get into the fundamentally different question and the report itself, are there any particular types of business sizes that you tend to speak to more than others in terms of HR teams or companies?
We actually have a really wide range of organisations on our books. One of the things I would say is that initially when we first worked in workplace wellbeing, I think because we come from a public sector background ourselves, having worked in the NHS, we tended to attract more public sector and charitable organisations. But now we have a much wider reach, I would say, and we still have a good representation of those types of organisations, but we have much more commercial kind of organisations approaching us now too. So right from very small to massive.
Yeah. So what we'll do again, we'll pop in the show notes just a bit more detail about the guys at Ultimate Resilience. So if you want to reach out to Jo or Felicity, anyone in their team, then you can do so via that. Let's get on to the UK Mental Wellbeing Report for 2025. But before we do that, my fundamentally different question, which, if you've never listened to the pod before, is a completely and totally random non-HR or payroll related question, just as a bit of of an icebreaker. And Joe is now familiar with my randomness. And so today, Joe, I'm going to hit you with the news that there is a identical replica of the boat from Jaws called the Orca, I think it was in the movie, that a superfan has completely recreated. And that got me thinking, what would you create? If there's anything you could recreate from childhood, from anywhere in your life, which maybe doesn't exist before, or maybe just because you're a super fan, what would it be? And to give you a minute or two to compose some thoughts, as I've hit you with that question, I'll go first. I would have the DeLorean from Back to the Future. Those suicide doors, the flux capacitor, all of the little gadgets and gizmos in it, that is my sort of thing. So I would go for Doc Emmett Brown's DeLorean from Back to the Future. What are you going to hit me with?
Well, I immediately started to feel a bit nostalgic. I started to think about childhood and all the things that I missed from childhood. And you know what's just come to me? One thing I really miss and something I would love to recreate is Sundays without shopping.
Sundays without shopping. Yes.
I don't know, spaces that aren't filled with commercial stuff. Sundays where if there are no shops, then there's no opportunities to go out and part with our money. And obviously, we've got online shopping now, so we'd have to close down the internet in order to have no shopping on a Sunday. And I'm not a religious person. It's not about protecting Sunday for religious practice, although I'm sure there are people who would wish to do that, and that's fine. But I think to have a day when we could just do other stuff that isn't about spending money would be a wonderful thing. And actually, I do feel very fondly about that when I look back to my childhood, even though I spent a lot of Sundays feeling very bored.
Yeah. There's so much information and the commercialism of life. True Sunday of rest. It's certainly an interesting thing, given how I seem to spend most of my weekends doing some form of shopping for something, whether it's gardening or food or clothes or whatever it is. I could get on board with that. It would also help mental well-being and health of people as well, which is my superb, excellent segue into talking about the report. Now, you're going to talk a little bit about the details. I'm going to quiz you about some of the bits within it, but just as a bit of an initial framing exercise, we've already run one podcast. I think it was earlier on this year. I probably need to double check my timings. A lot of podcasts and when they happen tend to blend into one when you do as many as we have on this pod, but it was called Who Supports the Supporters, and it was somebody who had talked to us about their own experience of losing a loved one through suicide, actually, and the impacts that had on them mentally. What was good about that podcast was it was a really good opportunity to reflect and ask the question. HR is obviously always outward looking and thinking about the people within its business and making sure that they're okay. And the question was, who is supporting them as the supporters? So we got into a really good debate about that. And I think that really speaks to the nub of what this report is about. So can you just maybe give a minute or two talking about the report, why you wrote the report, and then we'll get into some of the specifics, I think.
So as you know, we ran this report for the first time about a year and a half ago in 2023, back end of 2023. And we decided to do it because we were hearing an increasing number of HR professionals talking about how much they were struggling. And in fact, they were starting to come to us for support, for training or coaching in a way that they had never done before. And so we were really interested in what was going on here, why this was happening. And so we looked out into the ether, into the internet, and places to see what data there was out there about the mental well-being of HR professionals, and we found basically nothing. So if you look up on Google or indeed AI nowadays, if you use keywords like HR well-being, what you get is lots of advice for HR professionals on how they can support other people's well-being, and almost nothing on their well-being. And so we thought, well, let's design a survey with research backgrounds. We've published other research before. We just thought, this is a really interesting area to explore. So we designed a survey, and it was a kind of pilot, really, that first one. We got 100 respondents, and the results were quite surprising, quite stark, and we attracted quite a lot of attention for that. Once we published a report, it clearly tapped into something that was going on for people. It resonated with people very much, and people started to talk to us and come to us with their own stories. So we decided we would run this survey again, and this year we got almost 1,500 respondents. So we got a significant increase in the number of people taking part in this survey. And one of the things I guess to highlight is that now we have a sample which really says something. This is a set of data that we can't ignore. Before it was like, this could be a bit of a fluke. We've got 100 people responding to this survey and they're saying something quite serious, but is it really representative of what's going on in HR? And this time, yes, absolutely. It feels like it's representative of what's going on in HR.
And there's a couple of times in the report where there's the description emotional labour that runs through it, which I thought was really fascinating and really made me think, as a marketing person, obviously I work within the HR industry, but for a HR consultancy. So I'm not a HR practitioner, but this idea of understanding the emotional labour and the toll that that takes on HR professionals. Because if you think about the work that they do in dealing with things like grievances, there's performance management. In some organisations, there's massive restructuring exercises and the pressures that go on there. This isn't a function where you're dealing in sales that has its own pressures, but it's also celebrated when big sales are made. Is HR as celebrated? And so this idea of the toll that it takes through this phrase, emotional labour, I found quite fascinating. Can I just before we start getting into some of the details, because obviously you break down the report into depression, anxiety, burnout, psychological wellbeing. We'll talk about those in a second, but just give me some initial reflections on this idea of this role that HR professionals play and the emotional labour and the toll that takes on their work.
I've worked in a profession that has a high level of emotional labour. I've sit in front of people who tell me very difficult things, who share their deepest emotional fears, struggles, etc. And it's very well recognised that people like myself working in healthcare settings are experiencing emotional labour because they are dealing with human beings who are suffering. And they're also dealing with difficult conversations, delivering bad news, those sorts of things. And so that's where the crossover is between my work and what I've done through my career and HR, because they're doing all that stuff too. Like, as you said, they're delivering bad news. They are dealing with some very complex and unpleasant interpersonal issues, situations. They are facing some of that traumatic stuff too. People come to them with their domestic abuse, their trauma, their difficult life experiences. They're dealing with employees who might have terminal illnesses. This has an impact on us. Working closely in close quarters with other human beings who are suffering has an impact on us. Through my career, that's very well acknowledged and recognised. It's very well acknowledged and recognised that this is what happens across healthcare professions and in other professions like social work, for example. But it hasn't really been well acknowledged in HR. But it's really clear to me, both anecdotally and through the results of our survey, that that is playing a very big part in the sort of struggles, the wider mental health struggles that HR professionals are experiencing.
Yeah, and then that manifests itself, as you guys have laid out in the report, under some of these key headings. So perhaps we should delve into some of those one by one. So obviously, I mentioned them earlier, depression, anxiety, burnout, and then you also talk about psychological wellbeing, which I think is a fascinating one. Let's talk about the depression side first. Do you want to give a few nuggets of what some of your data has told you based on what the respondents, the 1,400 respondents came back to you?
Sure. So just to explain, we used standardized measures of depression, anxiety, burnout, and well-being. So these are established questionnaires. And in fact, the depression and anxiety ones are questionnaires that I would have used in my clinical practice in the NHS to kind of screen people around whether they might be presenting with sort of clinical levels of depression and anxiety. So these are really established questionnaires which give us some meaningful data about what people are experiencing. And in relation to depression, what we found that was that 44% of the respondents were in the range for clinically significant symptoms of depression. So that's almost half of our respondents. And we compared that with what we would expect to see in the general population. So ONS data about what are the levels of depression in the general population. And we found that that figure of 44% is 2.5 times higher than depression levels in the general population. And we found with anxiety, 38% of our respondents experiencing anxiety symptoms within the clinical range, and that is 1.5 times higher than in the general population. We found that we had 63% of respondents where burnout is very likely. And then a further 15 identified as at risk of burnout. And then 67% were in the range for low well-being. So what we have is a group of people who are clearly struggling really quite significantly. And actually, it's likely when we're thinking about comparing with the general population that they're struggling more than many of your other employees within an organisation. And there's an irony there, isn't there? Because HR professionals are usually tasked with ensuring that there is wellbeing provision in place for the rest of the organisation. So they're tasked with looking after everyone else, but actually they're struggling more than everyone else.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. I guess, so those 4 key areas that you just pointed out there, depression, anxiety, burnout, and psychological well-being, if I'm listening into this podcast as a HR professional, I guess the first question that pops into my head is why? Why is that? Or what as well? Like, what is it? How is that manifesting itself? And you talk about that, I think it's on page 14, where you list the top 3 sources of stress at work, for example. Because I think that why are HR professionals feeling this depression, and why are they feeling this anxiety and burnout and lack of psychological well-being? So can you give us a bit of a broad overview on that one as well?
So we asked, in terms of sources of stress, I mean, I think there's some wider factors that we might talk about, some contextual factors and contributing factors that we might talk about. But in terms of sources of stress, we asked people, what are your main top 3 sources of stress? And we had a list of about 15 items, and that included things like lack of influence, lack of training, legal stuff. So it consisted of a list of 15 items, and people picked their top 3 out of that list. And the things that came out top, so 50% of our respondents said workload. Now that's consistent right across organisations and workplaces. So you ask any set of workers what their main source of stress is, and it's likely that workload is going to come out on top. So that's fairly consistent. Data, for example, shows that workload's very high in terms of contributing factors to stress. Our second highest at 41% was poor management. Our third highest was lack of support at 29%. And then we had an open text box called Other. So people got to write in other things that they felt were contributing to their stress. And the top 3 things that came out of that set of responses, there was about 148 responses we had there. The top ones that came out there were lack of recognition, toxic workplace culture, and the emotional toll of the work. So going back to emotional labour, the emotional toll of the work. Yeah. So those were the things that were identified by our respondents as the main sources of stress. I don't know if you want to talk about those now, but
let's go for it.
I'm obviously not an HR professional, and so I'm kind of looking in from outside and getting to know the profession and the people who work in it and all the different roles and the things that people do within the profession. And so I'm learning and growing my knowledge along the way. So I'm certainly not the oracle on HR, but these are some of the thoughts that I have based on what people talk to me about. It feels like even before the pandemic, things were tough. The pandemic came along, and actually it was really tough for HR professionals during the pandemic. They were the sort of unsung heroes when it comes to our key workers. A load of stuff landed on their laps, and they were having to work extra hard on all sorts of levels through the pandemic. And then we came out of the pandemic and there was no let up. So we had, cost of living crisis. We had all sorts of new policies and procedures with hybrid working and flexible working and all those kind of things, remote working. We've got an increasing number of employees suffering from mental health difficulties and challenges. We've got a world context which is increasingly scary, which is also impacting on employees, and employees are coming to HR professionals with all of that. So there's this kind of, and then you've got things like new employment law on the horizon, and so there's a whole raft of things which have just added to the work of HR and contributed to stress. I think there's a kind of I suppose there's also been a broadening of the remit of the role. It's broadened out really quite significantly. If we think about long term, it's become a much broader and wider reaching remit. And, that's not a bad thing in many ways. It's become professionalized. It's gone from a kind of essentially admin role to a highly professional role, and hopefully a role that has loads more influence in a business. But in that transformation, HR have taken on a whole raft of additional roles and responsibilities. And I think alongside that, there hasn't then been the recognition of what the impact of that is on the HR professional themselves as individuals and teams. I think in that transition from essentially a personnel admin role to something that's much broader and much more meaningful, actually, there is this factor of emotional toll and emotional labour, which I don't think has been very acknowledged. Because of that, HR professionals themselves don't feel confident to come forward and say, actually, this work is impacting me. This work is having an effect on my emotional well-being. They haven't found a voice yet, which allows them to feel comfortable to say, I need something, I need support, this is affecting me. So there's been this kind of conspiracy of silence that's gone on that I think we've all colluded in many ways, because it's convenient for us to all assume that HR will just deal with it, whether it's a suicidal employee or whether it's a really tricky grievance procedure or process. It's convenient for us to go, they'll deal with it, it's fine, their HR. And actually, we're all invested in that sort of false belief that they've got this ceaseless ability to just deal with stuff and never complain about it or raise it, or it never affect them.
Yeah, I guess so. Then the next question you've highlighted there, we've gone through the different sections. We've also then talked about why is this happening? Inevitably, because we've got about 5 minutes left for the pod finishes, I want to get into what can be done about it? Because I think that's the kind of practical, okay, guys, you've just listened to Joe and Chris talking a little bit around some of these stats and interesting information, but what can you practically be doing back in your business that can help to tackle some of these challenges? Because if you're feeling this, if you're facing this, and if you're listening to this, and you are feeling like you're one of some of those worrying percentages, you need to think about what the solution is for it. I quite like the way you guys have broken it down into, so there's 3 levels really. There's the organizational level, there's the individual level, and then there's the professional level as well. So can you just touch on that, just as we're wrapping up the last 5 minutes of the pod, like the advice that you guys give of those 3 levels and what businesses can do, what people can do, but then also what industry-wide can be done?
Yes. So, I'll start with the professional level. I feel like there's an onus on the professional to acknowledge that this is a very serious situation we find ourselves in. It's nothing short of a mental well-being crisis, I would say, in the profession. And so there's something about acknowledgement which is really important. And then, driving some solutions, some ways forward. We talk in the report about mental health standards. So maybe it's about saying, okay, we want to ensure and support organisations to ensure that they have a minimum standard in terms of the level of support that's available for HR professionals, that they are producing metrics around their well-being, so their HR professionals are having their well-being monitored more closely so that we can intervene more quickly. I think the profession has a real responsibility to sort of drive some of that stuff and support and encourage organisations to put these kind of things in place. I think at an organisational level, one of the really important findings of our research and our survey is that people who feel well supported, and only 13% of our respondents said they felt well supported in relation to their well-being at work. But if you feel well supported at work, you are significantly less likely to be suffering from mental health difficulties, from burnout, from poor well-being. You are significantly less likely to have taken time off sick due to stress or other mental well-being issues in the past year, and you are significantly less likely to be thinking about leaving the profession. So support is incredibly important. And we've launched our HR supervision service. It's a way of addressing that support gap. We see supervision as something that has protected us and supported our professional and personal development. We just think this is something that is really needed across the profession, not just these one-off bits of support that come in and go away again, something that is really robust, that we know works, and that is consistently there for people. Organisations need to be thinking about about support systems and how they embed those within their HR teams. And for individuals, because of course there are a lot of lone HR people who are struggling quite a bit. And then on an individual level, I think there's a real stigma and there's shame around for people, but actually just talking to another person in HR, just reaching out and having conversations about the impact of the work with other HR professionals, but whether that's friends, whether that's at work, informally, really helps. I think opening up the conversation, saying it's okay for us to talk about this, has a really normalizing effect. And actually, when we know we're not alone and we're not the only ones experiencing something, that is really powerful and really helps us in terms of the way that we cope, because we feel like it's not us at fault. It's not us who can't cope enough. It's not us who are flawed in some way. Actually, other people are experiencing this too. And I think that's really important and powerful for people.
Yeah, and there are lots of avenues in which you can utilize that, even things like conferences. So you can meet, there's peer networks. We do roundtable networking, lunches, breakfasts, dinners, talking about common themes. But actually, sometimes it's also just nice to hear that, what we're doing is very similar to what other people are doing. We're not standing there alone as individuals or as departments or as businesses or whatever it is.
I think this is happening already to some degree on an informal level. I hear from HR people who say, it's just really helpful to be able to talk to other HR people. But I think that we could all just step out of our comfort zones a little bit more so that we are kind of setting an example too. I mean, I think leaders particularly could, it's important that they do that.
Yeah, 100%. We are just on time, so I'm going to give you a bit of a free swim, which is any kind of final thoughts. Because if you're listening into this, I often speak to our guests and we come up with a few different points of view, and then I end up not speaking about half of them because we go off on different tangents. But any kind of final thoughts you want to leave anybody with before we wrap up today?
Well, I suppose workplace wellbeing is something that I've been passionate about for the last 10, 12 years or so. And one of the big mistakes I see people making a lot in organisations is picking something when you haven't really defined what the problem is and picking something that is not suited to the problem. And so I'd really encourage organisations and HR leaders, if you're thinking about putting something in place to support your HR teams, to be thinking about that question, what problem do I want to be solving here? What issue do I want to be addressing here? What's most well suited to that problem or that issue now and over the longer term? So I would leave you with that, really. To think before you just grab at something that you think is a solution just because everyone else is doing it or talking about it or it's the latest thing on the market.
Yeah, that's a really good bookend to what has been, once again, just a fascinating debate. As I mentioned right at the top of the show, what we'll do is we'll put the report in the show notes. It's called the HR Mental Wellbeing Report by the team at Ultimate Resilience, who have also been supported by the guys at Towergate Employee Benefits as well. Jo, thank you very much for joining me, as always.
Thank you so much. It's been brilliant.
It's been really, really good to have you on, and we'll get Jo on again in the near future, and maybe it'll be up to 10,000 recipients next year when you do it. But hopefully we've started to see some changes away from some of those stats as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast as much as I have enjoyed recording it. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about Jo, what's the best place to get access to you? Is it on LinkedIn or via the website?
Yes, so I'm on LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn talking about HR wellbeing. So, please do come and follow me and connect with me and send me messages. I get messages pretty much every day from HR professionals now. So I'm Dr. Jo Burrell on LinkedIn, and our website is ultimateresilience.co.uk.
Lovely. Thank you very much for listening in. There's nothing left more for me to do other than to say on behalf of Jo and myself, thank you very much. And we will catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.